In this video, I'm going to walk you through the steps of creating an equity screen in FactSet. To begin, you'll want to open FactSet on your workstation, and we're going to need to navigate to the equity screening application. Now, on my workspace, I have a series of tabs at the top, one of which is screening, so I can simply click on that. If you don't have that, you can go up to the search box and type in @US for universal screening. And when we select that, it's going to take us into the application. Now you'll notice that there are a number of pre-built screens which can be used to better understand how different investment strategies can be translated into the language of equity screening. But we're going to begin with the starter screen. So when you click on starter screen, it's going to take you into the application itself. Here we can begin to identify the universe of companies that we're going to use as part of our equity screen. Now, when you think about screening, it's analogous to a filter. And when I say that, what I mean is this. You start with this large universe of companies and you systematically apply different criteria to whittle that list down to a more manageable group of securities that we can do some fundamental analysis with in order to find attractive investment opportunities. Now you'll note that if we look up here under the select criteria, that by default the starter screen includes the constituents of the S&P 500 index, and that's why there are 500 companies listed under results. Now, in our case, what I'm going to do is walk you through the process of replicating Joel Greenblatt's magic formula, which is a two-factor screen that's used to identify high-quality stocks that are trading at attractive valuations. And so I'm going to remove this initial criteria simply by clicking on the red X. And I'm going to use the Add Criteria box in order to define my universe. And Joel defined the starting universe as companies that were headquartered in the United States that have a market cap of at least $1 billion. So if I start typing in the Add Criteria box, and I'm just going to type in North America, I can see that if I look down through the list, one option is to isolate on those companies that are headquartered in the US. So I'm going to restrict the universe to just those companies in the US, and you're going to see that it's going to update, and there are 40,559 companies in the US. Next, we want to look at those companies that are trading at a market cap of at least $1 billion. And so market cap is just the market value of the company. We use it as a measure of size, and we calculate it by taking the product of the current price multiplied by the number of shares outstanding. And so when I type in market value, the first thing that pops up here is the market value at the company level, and I'm going to select that. And you'll notice that when you select a particular factor, it's going to give you a description. And in this case, it says returns the public market value of companies listed, of the companies listed equity. So that sounds right. We also see that the units in this case are in millions. And so since we want to restrict this to companies that have a market cap of at least $1 billion and it's listed in millions, I'm going to say that we want the market value to be at least 1,000. Now, I would note that you can also change the characteristics of this formula. In this case, it's going to, by default, it's going to bring in the current market value for the last completed period. That would have been yesterday's closing price in the local currency. And then we're asked how we'd like to treat non-traded shares. And I'm going to exclude those. And so at this point, I've got my criteria, so I'm going to click the Add New button. And when I do that, what's going to happen is it's going to update my screen, and what you can see is that there are 1,985 companies, so just less than 2,000 companies traded in the US that have a market cap of at least $1 billion. Now, last but not least, this formula excludes a couple of sectors, specifically financials and utilities. Financials because they're often viewed as black boxes, and utilities because they're a regulated industry. And so when I type in financials, the first thing that pops up here is the GICS financial industry. And GICS is just an acronym for the Global Industry Classification System. It's how Standard & Poor's classifies companies, and it's commonly used in the industry. So I'm going to select that. And it'll update my criteria. Now, what you'll notice is it'll take those 1,985 companies and whittle it down to 197. And that's because there are 197 companies that are categorized as financials in the in the US. And so what I want to do is I want to change this. I don't want to just restrict my universe to those companies. I want to exclude them. So I'm just going to change. I'm going to click the drop down menu and click exclude. Now, one thing that I would note here is that let's say that you're responsible for a particular sector of a broader benchmark like the S&P 500, then in that case it would make sense to isolate in on that sector as your universe of companies and focus there, but that's not what we're doing today. I'll also bring in utilities, and you can see that again the first thing that pops up here is the GICS utilities industry. Typically, you'll find that most often when you type in what it is that you're looking for, the first one is typically the right one. So I'm going to exclude that as well. And basically what that's going to do is restrict my universe to those companies headquartered in the US with a market cap of at least $1 billion that are not trading in either the financials or the utility sectors. So they're trading in one of the other 9 sectors of the GICS classification. And that gives me 1,739 companies. So again, think about that as the broad universe, the top of the funnel. And what we're going to now do is apply criteria in order to rank those 1,700 companies. And so if you look at Greenblatt's two-factor model, he basically uses earnings yield as a measure of value and return on invested capital as a measure of quality. Specifically, what he's looking for is high quality companies that are trading at attractive valuations. And so the way that he defines value is he uses earnings yield. Now, earnings yield can be calculated in roughly 2 ways. One is we take the PE ratio and we just simply invert it. And so instead of having price per share divided by earnings per share, now we've got earnings per share divided by price per share. And it calculates an earnings yield. The problem with that approach is that oftentimes companies that have a lot of debt in their capital structure are going to look deceptively cheap on a PE basis. So instead of doing it that way, he's going to use operating profit and enterprise value to calculate out that same earnings yield. So the first factor that we're going to need here is operating profit, or EBIT, which stands for earnings before interest and taxes. When I type that in, you see that it gives me EBIT, and it's in the FactSet fundamentals database. So when I select that, you'll see that the code that's returned is FF underscore EBIT underscore OPER. So the FF stands for the FactSet fundamentals database. The easy way to think about this is that if you're looking at data that's being pulled off of one of the 3 financial statements, it's going to be in their fundamentals database. Whereas if you're looking at forecasted information that may come from sell-side research reports, that's going to be estimate data. So the code there will be FE for FactSet estimates. Now, by default, it will either come up as annual or quarterly. And I'm going to choose quarterly. That way the screen will update at least 4 times a year as we get new information. And I'm going to use the non-restated data So what that's going to mean is that the formula is going to look at quarterly data, and it's going to use the most recent quarterly information. That's why we're plugging a 0 here for time period 0. And I'm just going to bring that in to my screen. Now you'll notice that I didn't apply that criteria to restrict my universe. Rather, we would consider that to be a display item, and that's why it's showing up here as one of the columns in my report. Now I should note that what we can do is we can come over here to parameters, and this is actually going to show you the screening criteria that we're using. Now by default, it's going to bring in some basic information, specifically the company and its ticker symbol. And then it also includes some other information, which frankly I don't really find that useful, like the stock exchange, their industry, and so forth. And so again, just like we saw above, we can remove those rows by simply clicking on the red X. So I'm going to do that just to clean this up a bit. And so what I'm left with is my operating income for the company. Now, if you don't like the way that it's labeled under headings, all you have to do is double click and simply change that. So I'll just change it to EBIT for operating income. And so that's my first piece of information. Now, the other thing that we need here, of course, is the enterprise value. So I'm just going to type in EV for enterprise value. And again, we see that that pops up in our drop down. It's already set to be quarterly information, and so we can just simply add this as the next piece of information. Now here, again, I'm going to relabel this. I'm just going to say that it's enterprise value. And so I've got the two pieces that I would need in order to calculate out the earnings yield for the companies in this universe. And so I'm going to go back up to add columns, and I'm going to use a row reference, meaning that I'm going to reference the two rows that I've brought into my equity screen, which are labeled here as P1 and P2. Again, you can relabel those if you want, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to leave them as is. So if you want to use a row reference, it's going to be pound P, and then you're going to put in a period in whatever row it is that you want to reference. So since we're calculating earnings yield, which is operating profit divided by enterprise value, I'm just going to type in pound P, P1 for row 1, and then I'm going to divide that by pound P, again, another row reference, P2. And that's going to bring in my enterprise value. I'm going to want to do a couple of things here. One is that you'll notice that when I bring in these row references, it's going to do the calculation. But in FactSet, one thing that you can do as you get a little bit more savvy with the screening tool is that you can begin to exclude companies that may not have the characteristics or the attributes that you're looking for. So in the case of earnings yield, one thing that we want to exclude are companies that have negative operating income. And the easy way of doing that is, instead of using a slash for divided by, we use a double slash. And so I'm going to do that. The other thing that I'm going to do here is I'm just going to wrap a set of parentheses around this calculation, and I'm going to multiply it by 100 in order to put it in integer format, just so that when I look at the output, it's something that is a little bit more discernible. So when I hit enter, that's going to add my calculation. Now you'll notice here under heading, since I did a row reference, I don't have anything here. So I'm going to double click, and I'm just going to simply type in earnings yield. So anyone who's looking at this report knows what's in that third column. All right, so we've got the first factor, which is earnings yield. So that's what we're going to use to rank companies from cheapest to most expensive. And now I need to bring in return on capital. And so return on capital in this case is being used as a measure of quality. Now, quality is an elusive term and it means different things to different people. But basically, when you see a company that has a high return on invested capital, the thought is that they must have some sort of competitive advantage that's allowing them to generate these high returns. And typically, that might come from something like a two-sided network effect. If you look at a company like eBay, where the more people that use that platform, the more valuable it becomes. But again, if there's some sort of competitive advantage, we would expect the company to be generating higher returns, and that would give us an indication that we're looking at a higher quality company. And so the way that Mr. Greenblatt calculates return on invested capital is he starts with that same operating profit and he divides it by the combination of working capital and net PP&E. So net working capital plus net property, plant, and equipment. So I'm going to have to bring in working capital and property, plant, and equipment. Now we could go through the same process of typing in, as an example, current assets. And again, what it's going to do is it's going to bring me in and give me the code that I'm looking for. So in this case, FF underscore assets underscore CURR for current. Now you'll notice in this case, it brings in annual data. We want to be consistent. So I'm going to change that to be quarterly data. Again, non-restated. And so I've got my current assets, and as we know, net working capital is just current assets less current liabilities. So we could do another search, or if you know the formula, you can just type it in. In this case, it's FF underscore LIABS for liabilities underscore CURR for current. And again, we're going to want to use quarterly data, so QTR, comma 0 for current quarterly earnings. And so I now have my formula, and so I can again click the Add New button, and that's going to add working capital to my screen. Now, what you'll see here is because we started with current assets, that's going to be the heading. And so I'm going to want to change that to be net working capital. Okay, and so now all we need is net PP&E. So I'm going to come up and do a search for net PP&E. And first thing that pops up here is property, plant, and equipment on a net basis. That just means that it's net of depreciation. Again, another item from the FactSet Fundamentals database. So I'm going to click on that. Since I used quarterly information last time, it brings up quarterly data. Again, for consistency, I'm going to use non-restated data and just simply add that as one more row in my spreadsheet. So I've got net working capital and I've got net property, plant, and equipment. And so now what I can do is I can put those together in order to calculate my return on invested capital. So again, I'm going to do this through a row reference. So pound P dot, and I'm going to reference earnings before interest and taxes. Now you'll notice that when I type pound P, it's automatically going to give me all the rows that I have in my spreadsheet. So I can just simply select operating profit, and then I'm going to divide that by another row reference, which is going to be the combination of net working capital and net PP&E. So pound P dot, and I'm going to bring in working capital, which was P4, row 4, plus pound P dot P5, which is row 5, which is where I have my net PP&E. Now when I look at what I've got here, it brings in the formula for calculating return on invested capital, which is again is operating income, row 1, divided by the combination of net working capital and net PP&E. Now, when I click on that, I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to do a couple of things. One, just as I did before, instead of using a single slash for divided by, I'm going to use 2 slashes to get rid of the fact that I might have some companies in there with negative operating income. I'm also going to wrap a set of parentheses around this formula and again multiply it by 100 to convert it from a percentage into an integer. So from a decimal to an integer. And just hit return in order to update that. Again, what I'm going to want to do here now is make sure that I put in a column heading, and I'm going to call that return on capital. So I've got the two factors now that Joel Greenblatt used in order to look for high quality stocks trading at attractive values. And the last thing that I need to do is to use those factors to rank the companies in my universe of 1,700 companies. And so to do that, I'm just simply going to use a rank function. So when I type in RANK for rank, it's going to bring up the rank builder, and it's going to ask me what it is that I would like to rank. And so under the parameter here, I can select whatever it is that I'm looking for. So I'm going to start with ranking the companies based upon earnings yield, which, if you recall, that was row number 3. So I'm going to reference that here. So pound P, and again, it's going to bring up the list of possibilities, and I'm going to select earnings yield. So it automatically adds that in here. And so what I can do is, whoops. Okay, so I've got my ranking now. I'm going to relabel this and just say that it's rank by earnings yield. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing in order to rank the companies based upon return on invested capital, which again is row 6. So when I come back up here, and I'm going to use the rank function again. Now, since I showed you how to do it the first time, I'm just going to type it in. So it's just going to reference row 6, so pound P dot P6. And what I can do now is add that criteria. And so now I've got everything that I need here in order to do my combined score. Okay. So last thing that I want to do is I don't want to just look at companies based upon earnings yield or return on capital, but both. And so I need a combined score. Now, when you do a ranking, basically what it's going to do is that higher values are going to be ranked higher. And so when you think about earnings yield, you want a higher yield because it's a measure of return. So higher is going to be viewed as better. Similarly, when you think about return on invested capital, you want higher returns indicating a higher level of profitability. So we can just enter those as is. If instead we were ranking companies based upon something like leverage, then obviously companies that have a high level of debt in their capital structure would be viewed as being riskier. And so in that case, we would want companies that had less debt, so lower would be better. And in order to get the ranking to work that way, all you have to do is to put a negative sign in front of the factor that you want to rank lower values as being better. And in fact, we're going to do that in our combined score, because when you think about it, when you rank companies, you rank them from best to worst, and best is going to be assigned a value of 1. Worst, in this case, is going to be 1,739. And so, given that, we're going to say that we want those companies that rank the best, closest to 1, on both earnings yield and return on invested capital. So I'm going to have to use that negative that I just referenced. So I'm going to say rank, open parentheses, negative, indicating that lower values are better. And I'm just going to put in my row references. So again, same thing as we've done before, pound P to reference the specific row, and I'm going to bring in the row that I'm looking for here, which would be rows 7 and 8. So P7, and I'm going to add the row reference for row 8. So pound P dot P8 as well. And so now I've got my ranking the way it is that I want it. Now when I do this, what it's going to do is it's going to rank all of these companies, all 1,700. And in reality, you're probably only going to look at the top X number of companies as potential investment candidates. And so just to make this list a little bit more manageable, what we can do is we can add in here basically a criteria to restrict that universe down. And I'm going to use the top 100 names, which is the way that Greenblatt prescribed. And so I'm going to want those that basically have a ranking of 100 or less. And so I'm going to put in less than or equal to 100. And because I want those with the lowest score indicating the best ranking, I'm going to say less than or equal to 100S, S standing for small. If you wanted those companies with the largest ranking, then we would input an L there instead. All right, and so what I'm going to do is hit return. And what you can see is up at the top, our results now have been restricted down to 100. We see the same thing down here for the number of securities that have passed our screen. So you'll note that while we started with 1,700, we only actually applied the rank to 1,268. And that again is because there must be some companies in that universe that had negative operating income, and we excluded those from inclusion. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch from parameter view over to the results view. So when I click view results, it's going to give me the companies that have the best combined score. Now you notice that one of the things that I must have forgotten to do is to label that last column. So I'm going to flip back here to parameters and come down here and I'm going to list this as combined score. Okay, and flip over to results again. And so I see that we've got some well-known names here like Apple and Biogen, and it also looks like we've got quite a few companies that are in the healthcare space. And so you can see some natural grouping that goes on with these equity screens if a lot of companies in a particular industry are trading at low values. So you think about something like biopharma, there may be industry related issues. Maybe it's that there's a lot of regulatory pressure on the companies to raise pricing, or there's a new legislation like the Affordable Care Act that may be impacting the price of those securities and by extension their multiple. There also may be company specific or what we would call idiosyncratic issues that have weighed on the company. And so as part of your fundamental analysis, where you're going to take this short list of companies and look at them closer, you'd want to try to figure out if those issues that have been weighing on the company's price multiple recently are going to persist. If so, they're cheap for a reason. If not, if they're more temporary in nature, then and you think that the stocks will begin to recover and trade at higher values in the future, then they may be attractive buying opportunities. Now, by default, these companies are just going to be listed in alphabetical order by ticker. But what we really want is to look at the combined score. But before we get there, one of the things you're going to want to do is just make sure that everything looks the way that you would expect. And so just as an example, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to look at the ranking by earnings yield. So I look at Apple as an example. Apple has an earnings yield of just about 2%, which is okay, but not great. And you see that it doesn't get a very high ranking as a result. So if I double click on the column heading, it's going to first list them from largest to smallest, and then ultimately, if you double click it again, from smallest to largest. And so if we look and we come back over here, the companies that are ranking at the top are those that have a very high earnings yield. We can see Scholastic Corporation, 9.1%, Crisp Therapeutics, 7.8%. So it appears that it's ranking the companies the way that we would want. I could do the same thing for return on invested capital. If I rank the companies based upon that criteria, what I would expect is, again, those companies that have a high return on invested capital are going to get a high rating. And so we see here AmerisourceBergen, as an example, has a return on invested capital of 162%, very, very high, 121 for Omnicom, and so they're ranking at the top. And so again, this looks like what we would expect. So we can come over here now finally and look at our combined score. And so I'm going to list them from lowest, remember, which was best, to worst. And that's going to give me a list of companies to begin using or to begin applying some fundamental analysis to. And so in this case, that would be companies like Ironwood Pharmaceuticals, Crisp Therapeutics, Booking Holdings, and Decker Outdoor Corporation as examples. All right, so hopefully you found this to be useful in better understanding how to use FactSet's screening tool in order to identify a short list of companies that you can then apply fundamental and technical analysis to in order to evaluate whether or not they truly do represent attractive investment opportunities. I would note that I've also created a step-by-step tutorial to go along with this video. You can access that either on the course website or through the Cutler Center website if you're doing this on your own, or if you just want a quick refresher. Thanks for your time.